This is why I hate the right-wing, left-wing thing, because I think those labels are long gone. They belong in the past. The divide in all our societies at the moment in the West is between those who support the individual and those who support the collective. That's it. There is no other distinction. And every issue that you name will quickly boil down to either a collective solution or trusting the individual.
For the wrong to rule, the good must just stand idly by. Well, this is a surprise Loza Fox show today because Rowan Dean, who is the most evil man in Australia, has come over to London, and he landed this morning, so he's not jet lagged at all. And we just had lunch, and we thought we'd have a chat. How are you, Rowan? And lovely to meet you face to face.
And you, Laurence. Laurence, thank you so much for lunch. And as has been pointed out to me, I do actually owe Harry Miller dinner.
Yeah, you do.
But that will come when Harry's back in Australia. But thanks so much for lunch today. Best way to look, I urge Australians who are coming to London, the best thing you can do when you arrive is go have lunch with Laurence Fox. That doesn't get any better. That's the way to start your trip to London.
You're so lovely. Right, okay.
But normally I'm interviewing you, so this is a bit of an odd one.
I'm interviewing you
I
now.
know, but this goes against type. We're playing against type.
Stop it.
Next, I'll be the good-looking one who's supposed to be James Bond, and you'll be the kind of weird Aussie guy.
Listen, Barbara Broccoli, we were friends once. Okay.
So, I'm all yours.
Okay, so, Australia, what the fuck happened?
What happened was the basic democratic rules were ignored, in fact, deliberately ditched. Australia has a series of states which have their own legal entities, the state premiers, their own governments, and we have a federal government that sits above it.
So wait, that means so you've got within like Victoria, Northwest Territories, whatever.
Yes, they all have their own government, and that state government is responsible for hospitals, schools, education, and so on. The federal government is responsible for broader things, security, and so on. And there is overlap in various areas. At the beginning of COVID, the best thing that happened to Australia and the most sensible thing that the federal government did is it shut the international borders. So in other words, it said, we're a bit large island, right? Okay, COVID's coming along, shut all the borders, let's wait and see what happens. Had Australia left it at that, would have been terrific. We would probably, I'm not an epidemiologist or whatever, but arguably, looking at other countries like Sweden, places like Florida, arguably, had we just left it at that, we probably would have had pretty much the same outcome in terms of deaths, in terms of cases, etc., that we had. We didn't need to do anything beyond that. And there are plenty of people who would agree with that point of view. But what then happened, and this is this disease that infects all democracies at the moment, people got scared and people said, governments, do something, please do something. Now, there's nothing a politician loves more than being asked to do something. Suddenly, hey, I've got a reason to exist. This is what I'm here for. I got to do something. So there was a rush from all the different governments to do something. The federal government, having shut the borders, should have just left it at that, but instead said, oh, we've got this great idea. And this was Scott Morrison, the previous Prime Minister, supposedly a centre-right conservative Prime Minister, laughably so. He abandoned the basic norms of the federal government. He abandoned his own cabinet, federal government.
Which is, so just so we understand here, so in terms of the UK, it would be like us taking Wales and Scotland to be part of the central cabinet.
Exactly. Yeah. So he set up a national cabinet which would have been exactly that. It would have been Boris Johnson and his health minister plus his chief health officers, along with the leaders of Wales, Scotland and so on, who were elected under different systems. So he set up a national cabinet, which was the state premiers and the state chief health officers, and the federal, just himself and his treasurer and his chief health officers.
But he's a conservative, right?
He's supposedly a conservative, and most of the state leaders, not all, but most of them were Labor leaders. So immediately you had this conflict. But what it meant, to the detriment of Australia, was that the premiers, who control the police forces, who control lockdowns, who control the hospitals and that, suddenly realised they had power without accountability and with endless funding. It's the ultimate perfect storm.
Where did the funding come from? Central
from the federal
government,
government,
which has been bypassed by the by
Precisely.
this. Okay.
So in theory, as the American states found out, each state shut itself down or imposed restrictions and suffered financially accordingly. So, for example, Florida did better because it didn't. California did worse because it did lock down. New York did worse, and other states did better. In Australia, the worse they locked down, the more they were applauded by their citizens for doing something. And the two worst were the two most left-wing governments, that of Dan Andrews in Victoria and Anastasia Palaszczuk in Queensland. They discovered they were garnering public support for lockdowns that they didn't have to finance, because all the businesses that went out of business were financed by the federal government. So
who didn't have a say.
Who didn't have a say in what was going on. So it was the most weird situation where the tougher they went, the more electoral support they got, plus it didn't cost them anything because the federal government was picking up the tabs. And at the worst point where you saw the worst draconian measures in Australia, in Victoria, not only did they have the highest number of deaths, 800 deaths, due to a quarantine fiasco, which is a whole other story, but they also were picking up 50%, and Victoria is just one of 8 states and territories, they were picking up 50% of all the federal government from jobs being lost. So
Which is QE or not? So is that printing money or not?
Yes, in essence, yes, absolutely. Australia almost had no debt. Under John Howard, Australia had no debt, none whatsoever. The Labor government of Rudd and Gillard spent money. The so-called Conservative government of Tony Abbott, then Malcolm Turnbull, then Scott Morrison, reduced the debt to pretty much close to zero. We're virtually back in the black. COVID came along and we're now $1 trillion in debt.
Fucking
the
hell.
biggest debt Australia's ever had. We're going to be paying it off for a generation. We had the most generous in the world, the most generous financing of people who were out of a job. So we had this thing called JobKeeper, which basically the government gave a blanket amount to any business who wanted to lay people off. The federal government said, well, we'll just pay you to lay them off. You can keep them. Here's an amount of money. And for many of those people, the amount of money they were getting from the federal government was more than they were earning. Yeah. So it was the ultimate situation where the government is paying you not to work.
So it's like
a lot of people got a taste for this.
So it was like furlough in England. But I grew up on David Boone and Merv Hughes drinking 40 bottles of VB bitter on the plane over to the UK.
I tried this morning, Laurence. I did my best, but...
But that's what I grew up
compete.
On. So for me, the English have this stupid joke where they go, Australia's full of convicts and also prison officers, and that's why it's happened. But for me, this whole thing was so odd because I was thinking the Aussies would be so against all of this stuff. What is it in the Australian psyche, other than the bureaucratic stuff that you've described? So if you had to go into the personal within the Australian individual who is voting left and who's doing this stuff, what would you say would contribute towards that?
Great question, and Clive James actually answered it many years ago, where he said that the problem with Australians is not that so many of them are descended from convicts, it's that so many of them are descended from prison officers. And there's this mentality in the Australian psyche of authoritarianism, which the larrikin culture fought against. The larrikin culture, I think it's an old Irish word, but the larrikin culture of Merv Hughes, Paul Hogan, all of that stuff, Crocodile Dundee.
David Boone, don't forget David Boone.
David Boone, Booney, all of those. That larrikin culture was a response against authoritarianism. It was very popular in the 70s and 80s, and there was this idea that we in Australia rebel against authoritarianism. The larrikin is dead. I actually did a documentary, The Death of the Australian Larrikin, of the Aussie larrikin. Can we put a link
to that in, Alex, please?
And the point is that basically during the 70s and 80s, Australians became woke before woke was invented. Australians fell in love with the idea that they could change the planet, that they could be better people than everybody else, that we could look after the environment better, that we would take care of everything, we'd be much better people than the rest of the world.
Well, in the 80s.
Yeah, even in the 80s, it began under Bob Hawke. So, for example, we stopped building dams, whereas Australia relies on dams. But in the 80s,
dams.
Well, dams are necessary in a country like Australia. A, to stop floods, B, so you can drink water.
I like
embarked
now.
on very environmental policies and also embarked on this idea that we are somehow kind of very compassionate and generous and everybody deserves a fair go, and basically that the government will pay for everything is the idea. And that idea began our welfare system is often derided as sit-down money, so the idea that you're paid to sit down. Well, that actually is what happened during COVID. People were literally paid not to work, and Australians ultimately are pretty lazy, and a lot of them went, this is great. Now, what has happened since, as the rest of the world has started opening up, governments realised we've got to open up, and this is the shocking thing, Laurence, is that we've ditched, which is fantastic, most of our COVID regulations, rules, but there's been no sense of explanation of why they were needed in the first place, because nothing has changed. And yet what was a year ago, police were literally throwing people onto the ground, arresting pregnant women in their pajamas. Back to your cultural question, there's this horrible streak in the Australian personality called dobbing in. This idea of dobbing in, you dob someone in. Snitching. When I was a kid growing up, a dobber was the worst thing you could be in the playground. You know, that was it. The Larrikin culture of the 70s, yeah, now you're a hero if you're a dobber. Right. And in fact, we had health ministers and police chiefs begging the population to dob in someone who was not vaccinated, or dob in someone who's not wearing a mask, or dob in someone who's not practicing social distancing. The politicians were begging the public to dob people in who lived next door to them. Now that is just, to me, the most grotesque abuse of what a nation should be and what leadership should be. And so again, back to your question of culture, Australian leaders abandoned any sense of a kind of moral leadership and went instead for a health totalitarianism, where the greater good, this idea of we're doing this to save everyone, doesn't matter what we do, we're doing it, so we're saving everybody. Enough people bought into that the politicians went, it feeds back in the focus groups. Focus groups are always the worst way to run a government, but anyway. And we had a situation where people were devoid of any sense of moral leadership, where the government accused anybody who criticized them of, oh, you're a granny killer, you want to kill Gran. So anybody who actually dared speak up and say, not sure about, do we really need 5-year-olds to be vaccinated? You want to kill Granny, do you? And I can't tell you the number of kind of interviews or TV shows where I'd be confronted with that same thing. You want to kill Granny? You mean you don't want vaccine mandates? That means you want to kill Granny.
But there's a like an illogical moral discrepancy about that, isn't there? Which is the fact that the vaccines lose their efficacy quite quickly. So therefore, surely you should just carry on jabbing the hell out of old people and leaving young people to get on with their lives. Wouldn't that be what you would do?
Laurence, COVID and logic are completely mutually incompatible. There is nothing that we've seen in COVID rules that are logical. And the logical decisions or policies that could have been pursued were all ignored. To the point, and I think it's the same in Britain, to the point, but certainly in Australia, as recently as 2014, Tony Abbott, who was a Conservative and was therefore ousted, our last Conservative leader, in 2014, Tony Abbott, his government drew up a set of very firm pandemic policies. And this was after SARS and bird flu and Hong Kong flu, all that sort of stuff. They went, okay, next pandemic, we've got to have some rules in place so we all know what they're going. Those rules were very clear: no masking, no mandatory vaccinations, no social distancing, no lockdowns, just simply protect the vulnerable. Logic. And tried and tested in the past as well. Why, between Scott Morrison saying shut the borders, which was a sensible, easy to understand, logical policy, did we suddenly turn around and literally do a 180-degree backflip on every single government policy? We had the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, telling us, standing up in front of the camera saying, there is no such thing as mandatory vaccination. We don't mandate vaccines in this country. while people were being fired because they wouldn't take a mandatory vaccination. So we had the politicians lying to us. We had the most draconian measures being imposed upon us, literally horse-mounted police chasing people off Bondi Beach. Because you're going to get COVID, aren't you, Laurence?
Yeah.
Sitting on one of the widest beaches on the planet, where there's probably no one for another, half a kilometre. You're a really public health threat there. But no, they marched them down and they dragged them off.
How does that make you feel, though, as a human being, that something so mad? So in America, I think they did something similar where they said you can go to the beach but you can't have a towel or stuff like that. It was like
we did better. Come on, Laurence, don't you suggest the Americans are better than us at madness and stupidity. We had a chief health officer that said that you could not catch a football because kids could pick up COVID at a football game if they caught the football that someone else had kicked with COVID.
What if they were
We had a
wearing
chief
mask and
health
gloves?
officer telling us you could catch COVID off pizza boxes, so don't order pizzas. We had chief health officers telling us the most insane things that were just accepted as gospel. And now, by the way, are frequently being said, we didn't really, we weren't sure about that one. We hadn't got that one quite right. So our insanity was off the charts.
And do you think that that's indicative of the human condition, that we are in the sort of very decadent West where we can have whatever we want? We can order something from Amazon which we should wipe down. Even Ben Shapiro was saying it on his own show. He said he used to wipe down Amazon boxes when they got delivered. Do you think that's indicative of a sort of this Ryan Fulmich thing of the mass formation, the idea that we just, if something crazy enough to not be true is presented as the truth, that we will just adopt it as the truth? Or have you lost faith in people?
No, I mentioned to you earlier the famous G.K. Chesterton quote that if people don't believe in God or something, if they don't believe in something, they will then believe in anything that comes along. It's that vacuum. It's that moral vacuum. But forget religion, if your political leaders don't offer you a clear, concise, logical set of moral values and straightforward concepts that you can grasp, they have failed. And that is what we had, a massive failure of political leadership. And people, if they aren't getting that political leadership, if you go back to the Thatcher days, or if you go back to leaders of the left like Bob Hawke, or leaders of the right in Australia like John Howard, they were very clear in something like, they didn't obviously have a situation like this, but you would imagine that a John Howard or a Bob Hawke or someone would have said, no, let's just relax, calm down. We can beat this thing sensibly. We've shut our borders. Don't panic. We don't need this. That sort of leadership, which we didn't get in the West, which we should have got in the West.
So in terms of borders,
Ron DeSantis leadership.
DeSantis did it exactly right. So in terms of borders, I was saying to you at lunch, I find it really annoying when people talk about other people's countries' politics, because we don't know it. And but in terms of borders, in Australia, you have a system of going, if you want to claim asylum in Australia or you want to move to Australia, first of all, you were put somewhere else. Papua New Guinea, I don't know, where is it?
Nauru, yeah.
Nauru.
Yeah.
So, and in England, we've got this thing of
Rwanda,
it just comes over. Do you think that sovereign borders must be protected in order to maintain a nation? Do you think you can have an open border policy and maintain a nation?
No, national sovereignty is absolutely critical. That was the great kind of post-war world, if you like, and it's a superb world because you get competition between nation states. The idea of open borders, Australia under Tony Abbott, and again the left said it would never work, it couldn't happen, it would be a disaster. He introduced the policy of sovereign borders. It's called Operation Sovereign Borders, and it basically allows legal immigration but completely prevents any kind of illegal immigration, and it's very clear cut, and it works, and it has worked. The stats are just very, very clear. There's no discussion there, but the left can't stand it because, well, there are those who argue that the left believe that they get more votes if they bring people in from other countries. I don't know if that's the case or not, but that's one of the arguments. But the idea of the nation state is critical. It's absolutely critical. And without it, the alternative is this kind of World Economic Forum concept of this technocratic
You learn
global
nothing
governance.
and you'll be happy.
Yeah, you
And
learn nothing and you'll be happy.
You said you're walking down Regent Street, and apparently the migraine flag is still up. Down.
There are plenty of flags up there.
Do you think it's anti? Can I ask you a question?
I think any kind of flag that deviates. I'm glad to see you've got. Well, it's the Sex Pistols version of the Union Jack up there, but it's a bloody good one.
Yeah, sure
any
do.
kind of. Again, it's the same thing. A nation state must be very clear. We're having this argument in Australia at the moment. And you can apply it to Indigenous flags, you can apply it to transgender flags, LGBT flag, it doesn't matter what it is. You have to place the national emblem or symbol above the others. You have to, for one simple reason, and that's unity. And a nation state relies and requires on all those individuals believing and feeling and knowing that they are all completely equal within that within that community and within those boundaries and within those borders. The moment you deviate from that and either say one of two things, actually anybody else can come in and, if they've, we'll give them an iPad and we'll look after them and do whatever, and you encourage immigration to the extent that the taxpayer can't afford it, that's a disaster. Equally, if within the country itself you promote or foster division and elevate the rights of one individual over the rights of another part of the community, doesn't matter what it is, you've immediately caused irreparable damage. And that's what these flags and these endless new symbols of new communities do.
So we've all looked on in horror at Australia and New Zealand. I think we know why we look on in horror at New Zealand, because of Jacinda, because she scares the bejesus out of me. But the future of Australia coming out of this, bearing in mind that Qantas is still your national airline, right? What is the future going to be? So you've got a huge number of elected people from different communities all over the land. So people are political parties standing up in Australia? Are there new forming political parties?
There are.
Right.
Australia is in turmoil politically because, the left are now in power, but the lowest election results for a government ever. So 7 out of 10 Australians did not vote for the Labor government. They voted for alternatives. That's the first time we've had both our national major parties on the lowest votes they've ever had. So there are a plethora of parties on the so-called right, the freedom parties. Your tattoo there would be a perfect, yeah.
So
the so-called freedom parties.
Freedom and space, darling, freedom and space.
Unfortunately, the so-called freedom parties are very disjointed, dispersed. They agree on some things, disagree on others. They're kind of in a loose agreement. They give preferences to each other. But we saw in the last election an absolute fragmentation of undecideds, I think, made up, I forget what it was. It was the largest number it's been for a long time. So
none of the above.
Turmoil.
Yeah.
There's a lot of dissatisfaction with the political process there, and it's not surprising.
Can I ask a question, please?
Yes.
Yeah, I was quick to come in.
Hop in.
So most people watching this will know you from your awesome monologues on Sky News Australia. And I wanted to say that while Australia undoubtedly had some of the most draconian lockdowns, you actually became a sort of a kind of bastion of free speech. In Britain, people were watching your monologues more than anything we had here, because we had Piers Morgan, the BBC, everybody was a slave to COVID. So I want you to try and tell us the lessons you'd learned about press freedom, and more to the point, how the media is controlled, and how much stick did you get as a voice of the counter-narrative?
Okay, George. So the stick comes relentlessly from the left, but we also saw quite a few attempts within the Senate Australian Senate, to kind of question various aspects of things I'd said and others people on Sky had said. Without Sky News Australia, which is a superb media organisation, it's literally all of the left in Australia is the answer there. Sky News Australia, we have plenty of different characters with different ideas. You can watch it some parts of the day and it's quite left wing. You can watch other parts of the day or night, and it's much stronger opinions or different, more conservative opinions. But the point of that program is it tries to live up to the concepts of free speech, exchange of ideas. Opinions are opinions, news is news. we go so far as to, blue is when you're in opinion and red is when you're in news, to draw the distinction, which a lot of media outlets don't do. And I think we do it very well, but it does rely on the backing of Sky News Australia to say, yep, we will support those individuals so long as what they're saying, they've researched it, they've done their homework, they know what they're talking about, the facts are there, they're expressing an opinion based on their research or their beliefs or whatever. Great, go for it. And the theory being, as you're saying, Laurence, the more exchange, the classic free speech argument, the more you exchange different points of view, the more likely you are to come to a better outcome. But what you will never get is a good outcome by suppressing different points of view. And we saw that all through COVID. We see it on climate change, we see it on LGBTQI issues, we see it on so many issues, the critical race theory. The suppression of views is the danger at the moment. That's what leads to totalitarianism. This is why I hate the right-wing, left-wing thing, because I think those labels are long gone. They belong in the past. The divide in all our societies at the moment in the West is between those who support the individual and those who support the collective. That's it. There is no other distinction. And every issue that you name will quickly boil down to either a collective solution or trusting the individual. They're the two solutions on any issue you name. And the problem is all the major parties, and the reason being that even liberal conservative parties, Tory parties, liberals in our own country, any major parties have bought into the idea that they have the solution. The left have always said we have the solution. The right, or the so-called right, have gone, we've got solutions as well. We know how to do everything. We're just slightly different to them. That's the wrong argument. The argument should be, are we supporting the individual or the collective? And all the major parties support the collective and believe they have a collective answer to everything, and the rest of you just shut up and be quiet and do what we tell you to do. That is the problem in our politics today. This is why we need small parties with different points of view to come up and express them.
Oh, no! Wait. I have one final question. And how well put was that? Okay. One final question. I am friendly with John Anderson, who I really love.
Yeah.
And also, you're forgiven by your jet lag for calling him George, because I call it, his name is Dorbs. But you can call him Dorbs.
I follow my prompts. I get my prompts. That's what a good actor does. He feeds the lines.
Exactly. So my final question is China.
Yes.
Right. So John said to me, he said that what will happen is, as China's Belt and Road, it builds and builds and builds and establishes itself more and more and more, that places like Australia and even America will start to look to the older Magna Carta place, the UK, for some kind of intellectual thoughts on this. So as someone who is Australian, who I self-identify as an Australian cisgender white male, what would your advice to us in the UK be in terms of this very rapidly changing narrative, which, the culture seems to change every 5 minutes, as far as I can say. It's like I'm defending kids not wanking at 4. It's really weird. So what would be your advice from 3,500 miles away, 4,000 miles away? I don't know, I'm not good at geography. What would your... 12,000 miles away? Yeah. Okay. Alex, you might have to cut that bit out. What would your advice be from 12,000 miles away? You can keep it in. What would your advice be from 12,000 miles away to us? What do we, the Brits, have to bring to this global conversation? Then we can wrap up our chat.
Well, it's exactly the same thing, which is the reason the left love China is because it offers a single-minded, we know what's best for everybody. We're going to do it, here we go. You're all just drones, so long as the collective is looked after, we're fine. So that's the Chinese attitude. And that's why the left have always admired China. They've always liked them. In Australia,
loves them.
In Australia, they like them so much that they actually accept huge carrier bags full of cash from them, just as a sign of friendship. How politicians, particularly in the Labour Party, have been well known to do that. The Australian public has woken up to how pernicious China is. No question.
Are they frightened of China?
Yes, very frightened. Yeah.
So what?
And
So if China did. If,
so what can we learn from Britain?
What- no,
well,
what-
don't
what
get
would-
rid of your army and your navy, which is what you've been doing, and what
Yeah,
we're
yeah.
suddenly trying to rebuild ours.
Yeah.
That's the lesson. Defence. We leased. Let's end on a laugh, Laurence.
Yeah,
Let's
we
end on a
must.
laugh. The Australian government leased its most northern port, the port of Darwin, to a Chinese company. There you go. Owned by the Chinese government. Our major northern port. There you go. What a great idea. You can lease it for 99 years.
it's like Hong Kong all over again.
Yes, go.
Rowan Dean, you legend. Thanks, Bo. And now we know more about what's going on in Australia. There you go. You won't see that with fucking BBC.